Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honorable Deacon Mitchell, Prime Minister of Grenada. Welcome, Mr. Prime Minister. Please be seated. Honorable Deacon Mitchell, Prime Minister of Grenada. Senator the Honorable Claudette Joseph, Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs and Renewable Energy, Minister of Legal Affairs, Labor and Cooperatives. Honorable Karian James, Minister of Climate Resilience, the Environment and Renewable Energy. Senator the Honorable Decimo Williams, President of the Senate. Dr. Francis Alexis, King's Counsel. Dr. Sir Lawrence Joseph and Lady Anande Trotman Joseph. Ambassadors Dr. Trevor Lane, Mr. Terry Forrester. Judges of the High Court of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court. His Lordship, Mr. Justice Glasgow, and Her Ladyship, Madam Justice Agnes Actie. Members of the Magistracy, Chief Magistrate, Ms. Francine Foster. Other members of the Senate, members of the House of Representatives. Permanent Secretary, Ms. Perron Joseph. Other heads of government departments, including any chief technical officers of departments. Mr. Derek Sylvester, President of the Grenada Bar Association. Persons in our online audience, members of the media, before I forget, Chairman of the Public Service Commission, Ms. Deborah St. Bernard. Members of the media, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, everyone, and we apologize for the slightly late start. My name is Shireen Wilkinson, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this evening's 19th Sir Archibald Nedd Memorial Lecture. The lecture is under the theme, Reparations, Republicanism, and the Rule of Law. What next after 50 years of independence? Reparations and republicanism are two topics that have engaged our minds for quite some time now. And as Grenada moves towards 50 years of independence, the Grenada Bar Association has found this Sir 19th Archibald Nedd Memorial Lecture to be the most appropriate time to have an exciting and engaging lecture to be delivered by our featured speaker, the Honorable Deacon Mitchell, Prime Minister of Grenada. Following the Prime Minister's address, there will be a short interactive session with you, the members of our audience. But before we start, we have two housekeeping notes. We ask that you please be courteous to other members of the audience and keep your mobile phones on mute or vibrate. If you must make a call or take a call, we would be grateful for you to do that on the outside and then come back in. And in our interactive session, we ask that you please raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and the microphone will either be brought to you or you can come up to the microphone in the aisle in an orderly manner. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues all, as we start this evening's proceedings, we invite Pastor Gerard Keynes Douglas to lead us in prayer. May we all please stand.
Let us stay standing right after for the national anthem. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen all. Let us pray. And just before we do, the Word of God says, by His mercies we are not consumed. His mercies are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. So may the morning bring forth news of his loving kindness and tender mercies, and may he guide us in the path we should go. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your kindness and your love. We give you thanks that you have blessed us in this nation and in this region with a season of peace and well-being and harmony. And today, O Lord, after these 50 years of nationhood, our legal system, we thank you, has grown and developed to be a fair display of justice for our people. We thank you for the legal minds that have shaped the judicial system. May their legacy continue to blossom, motivate, and influence legal practitioners as they prepare the way forward and shape the pathway for those that will follow. Lord, we want to thank you for our legal fraternity in this nation, for its commitment to high standards of justice and fair play and a functional legal system. Let this lecture today, O God, sharpen their skills and deepen their commitment to uphold the finest virtues of the legal profession. So we pray for our Prime Minister as he delivers and reminds us and makes us cognizant of the struggles of our people over the years, of the state of play in the world today, where we are as a nation, and the way forward in the rule of law. And so, O God, we ask that you would cover him and you would bless this nation as we contemplate these salient truths and issues that will shape our future. Father, we just thank you for the bedrock principles upon which the sacred profession has been built and thrive. So we pray for our Minister of Legal Affairs and Attorney General. We pray for all the functionaries of that ministry. We pray for our justices and magistrates, and Lord, all of the court representatives and the registry and all members of the legal fraternity. We thank you for them. And we ask that, oh God, your presence would be felt here tonight. Your people would sense direction for the way forward, and you would bless this endeavor, and you would give grace, and your presence would fill this place. For we pray, giving you thanks in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen. And now the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace, now and forevermore. Amen.
Would you be so kind as to remain standing as we invite Ms. Tamara St. Bernard to sing the national anthem?
Hail, Grenada, land of ours, we pledge ourselves to thee. Heads, hearts, and hands in unity to reach our destiny. Ever conscious of God, being proud of our heritage, may we with faith and courage aspire, build, advance as one people, one family. God bless, God bless, God bless our nation.
Please be seated. Thank you very much. As we move swiftly into our program, It is with delight at this time that I invite Mr. Derek Sylvester, the President of the Grenada Bar Association, to make a few remarks. I'll say brief.
Honorable Deacon Mitchell, Prime Minister of Grenada, Honorable Karine James, Minister of Climate Resilience, the Environment and Renewable Energy, Senator the Honorable Claudette Joseph, Attorney General of Grenada, President of the Senate, Dr. Decima Williams, Dr. Francis Alexis King's Counsel, Dr. Sir Lawrence Joseph and Lady Anande Trotman Joseph, Ambassadors Dr. Trevor Lane and Terry Forrester, Judges of the High Court of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court, Justice Ralston Glasgow, and Madam Justice Agnes Acti, Chief Magistrate, Ms. Francine Foster, Chairman of the Public Service Commission, Ms. Deborah Sinbanar, Permanent Secretary, Ms. Perron Johnson, our Press Secretary, I think I see her here tonight, Ms. Neela Etienne, persons in our online audience, members of the media, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. The Grenada Bar Association is delighted to welcome you to the 19th Sir Archibald Nedd Memorial Lecture. This is the premier public education event of the Grenada Bar Association and the longest running lecture series by any bar association in the Commonwealth of Nations. Of this, the Grenada Bar Association ought to be exceedingly proud. The lecture series was launched by the Grenada Bar Association in July 1996 in memory of Sir Archibald Nedd, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Grenada, as it then was, and who transitioned on the 20th day of June 1992. The first lecture was delivered by Mr. Joseph Archibald, Queen's Counsel, then President of the OECS Bar Association. To date, 18 lectures have been delivered so far, and we're about to witness the delivery of the 19th. We have been fortunate enough to have had distinguished presenters, including Prime Ministers Mia Mottley from Barbados, Ralph Gonzalez from St. Vincent, and Dr. Kenny Anthony from St. Lucia. We also had the present President of the Caribbean Court of Justice, Mr. Adrian Saunders, and past President, Mr. Dennis Byron. Last year, our featured speaker was our very own Chief Justice, Dame Janice Pereira, DBE, LLD, who delivered last year's lecture on the topic, Mob Justice versus Real Justice, Sentencing, Social Media, and the Rule of Law. We reiterate, the purpose of this lecture series is a noble one. It affords the Grenada Bar Association an opportunity to contribute in a meaningful way to the education of the public on matters of a legal nature which may stimulate public interest. In fact, the public quest for knowledge and insight has been the catalyst for the generation of topics and the identification of speakers over the years. And this year is no exception. We have covered a range of topics, including insurance law, which was topical post-Hurricane Ivan, sentencing, social media, and the rule of law, enhancing the rule of law and justice in the Caribbean, 50 years of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court. Tonight, we have the distinct honor of presenting to you our brother and colleague, the Honorable Dickon Mitchell, Prime Minister of Grenada, to deliver this year's lecture on the topic, Reparations, Republicanism, and the Rule of Law. What next after 50 years of independence? This year's topic was chosen because reparations and republicanism are topical issues being discussed in the region and around the world, together with our impending 50th year anniversary celebration, a milestone to be celebrated and a good time to reflect on the past, present, and future. For those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Likewise, the past cannot be regained, although we can learn from it. The future is not yet ours, even though we must plan for it. Time is now. We have only today. Our Honorable Prime Minister is best placed in his position to expound on this topic. The current executive of the Grenada Bar Association has continued with the mantle of promoting public legal education and have accomplished a number of goals during our stint. To date, we have been successful in hosting the 18th Sir Archibald Nedd Memorial Lecture, Law Week 2022 and 2023, together with radio and television programs seeking to educate the public on legal issues. Last year, in this same location, the Bar Association issued a clarion call to the powers that be to invest more resources in our justice system, the building of a House of Justice, improvement of our registry facilities, and clearing of the backlog of transcripts to enable the processing of appeals. The present state of the deeds and land registry is untenable and must be addressed urgently. We commend that consideration be given to a land registration system in Grenada. This would aid in the reduction of property disputes and the proper demarcation of boundaries. The court dockets are replete with these cases. However, it is not all doom and gloom, for we have had some successes. We have seen the introduction of the e-litigation portal, which has resulted in a high level of efficiency in the filing and processing of court matters. This has greatly reduced the use of paper, as filing is now done electronically. The World Wildlife Fund and other like conservationists, I'm sure, would be happy. Also, the publication of the revised Civil Procedure Rules 2023 is another milestone to be celebrated. With the advent of Judicial Settlement Conference, wherein a judge can give a preliminary determination of the matter as an aid to its speedy disposition. We take this opportunity to commend our diligent and hardworking judges, magistrates, court and registry staff, who, despite the challenging circumstances under which they function, continue to accomplish their tasks. Let the record reflect that the Grenada Bar Association commend, congratulate, and appreciate each and every one of you. The Grenada Bar Association pledges and reaffirms its commitment to supporting the advancement of the justice system here in Grenada and beyond. Finally, we will continue in our mandate to empower, educate, and uplift our people through public legal education. For education is liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Growing up, I knew Sir Archibald Nedd as Uncle Archie, and he was this teddy bear of a man who always found time to play a game or crack a joke. But as I grew older, I learned that beneath that teddy bear demeanor was a judicial giant whose legacy will forever live on, as we are honoring him once again this evening. With those few words on Uncle Archie, as I knew him, I invite Mr. Francis Paul, the Vice President of the Grenada Bar Association, to give you a deeper understanding of Sir Archibald Nedd as he delivers his biography.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please allow me to adopt the protocol established by Madam Moderator and the President of the Bar, Mr. Derek Sylvester. Now, it is indeed a pleasure and honor for me to deliver a very short bio on that giant, that legal luminary, Sir Archibald Nedd. So Archibald was born on the 8th day of August 1916 in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He attended primary and secondary school in Grenada and was Grenada's 1934 Island Scholar. He then proceeded to King's College in London, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Laws degree in 1938. In November of that year, he was called to the bar by the Honorable Society of the Inner Temple. During his legal career, Sir Archibald served in several countries in several legal capacities. He returned to Grenada in 1939 and entered private practice until 1940, when he was appointed Registrar of the High Court and Additional Magistrate in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. From 1941 to 1943, he served in a similar capacity, Registrar and Additional Magistrate in Dominica. And from 1943 to 1944, was Magistrate in St. Lucia, where he also acted as Attorney General, a position that was then known as Crown Attorney. During the period 1944 to 1949, Sir Archibald worked in Dominica as Crown Attorney. In 1949, he took the decision to go to Africa and would remain there in Nigeria for the next 25 years. First for a 4-year period, 1949 to 1953, in the service of the government of Nigeria as magistrate with full powers, and then from 1953 to 1970, when he was engaged in private practice in that country. He then returned to the service of the Nigerian government for the next 4 years, until 1974, serving in the capacity of State Counsel and legal draftsman. In 1974, Sir Archibald returned to the Caribbean and was appointed puisne judge of the OECS Supreme Court and posted to Antigua, where he served for 1 year, after which he was transferred to his native Grenada, where he served from 1975 until 1979. We all are aware of the well-known events in 1979, and following the removal of Grenada from the OECS Supreme Court, Sir Archibald was then offered by the government and accepted the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Grenada. He served in that capacity until 1986, when he retired. In 1984, he was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth. Sir Archibald Nedd passed away on the 20th day of June 1992 after a long illness at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Barbados. Now, as the President said earlier, the Sir Archibald Nedd Lecture Series was launched in his memory by the Grenada Bar Association in July of 1996, with the first lecture delivered by Mr. Joseph Archibald, QC, then President of the OECS Bar Association. To date, as we heard before, 18 lectures have been delivered, with this lecture this evening being the 19th lecture. Our law library, which is not as functional as we would like it to be, was also named after Sir Archibald. Sir Archibald's memory obviously lives on and would continue to live on in the delivery of this distinguished lecture series. Thank you.
As members of the Grenada Bar Association, we recognize tonight's featured speaker as one of our own. We proudly claim him as our colleague, and all of us are honored to call him our friend. And we thank him for taking time out of his busy schedule to deliver tonight's feature address. Permit me at this time to invite Mr. Anderson Andel to introduce tonight's featured speaker, Hon.Dickon Mitchell, the Prime Minister of Grenada.
Thank you. The Honorable Dickon Mitchell, Prime Minister of Grenada, Honorable Senator the Honorable Claudia Joseph, Attorney General of Grenada and Minister of Legal Affairs, Honorable Kerry Ann James, Senator the Honorable Dr. Decima Williams, other honorable delegates, honorable judges of the Supreme Court of Grenada, Chief Magistrate, fellow and distinguished colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen all. It is my immense pleasure this evening to introduce our featured speaker, the Honorable Dickon Mitchell, Grenada's 9th Prime Minister and a fellow colleague in legal practice to many of us present here tonight. A man of humble beginnings, Dickon Mitchell's story is one of distinction and success, forged from hard work, determination, and a deep desire for betterment. He began his service to Grenada in 1996, serving for 2 years as a teacher at his alma mater, the Presentation Brothers College. This 2-year stint allowed him to appreciate the full spectrum of the educational experience in Grenada and cemented his desire to do more by advocating for the educational advancement of all Grenadians. In 1998, he enrolled at the University of the West Indies in pursuit of a law degree. After completing the Hugh Wooding Law School in Trinidad, his commitment to serve Grenada brought him straight home, where he commenced his law practice at the law firm of Grant Joseph & Co., where he immediately distinguished himself as a formidable lawyer representing many individuals and business entities. 3 years later, he would go on to acquire the law firm of Grant Joseph & Co. In 2016, Dickon Mitchell opened another law firm, Mitchell & Co., a maneuver strongly influenced by his vision to create more employment for young and upcoming lawyers. His ambitions having been always tethered to the desire to give back, and as such, he never divorced himself from the community. His collective experiences as a teacher, lawyer, mentor, and youth advocate shaped his commitment to Grenada and motivated his decision to enter the political arena. On June 23, 2022, only 8 months into his political career, Dickon Mitchell led his party to victory, and he was sworn in as Prime Minister of Grenada on the 24th June 2022. As Prime Minister, the Honorable Dickon Mitchell is working with his cabinet of ministers to move Grenada forward, building the foundation for an equitable society that takes pride in its culture, heritage, and identity. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in raising a round of applause as we welcome to the podium our featured speaker, the Honorable Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell.
I live in England, and I'm not paying reparations for slavery from 200 years ago. The reasons are clear. One, my ancestors were slaves under the Romans, the Vikings, the Normans. I'm not crying about reparations from Italy, Scandinavia, or France. I'm glad my ancestors were slaves. I'm sorry for their troubles. But the only reason why we live and exist today is because of what occurred in the past. It is naive and ridiculous to view history that way. To think that people who are alive today would still be alive if the slave trade from 200 years ago had not existed. Your prime minister would not be alive. His ancestors from 200 years ago would have a totally different life path. He owes his existence, along with the rest of all of us, to what choices our ancestors made or didn't make. Why pick on us all the time? Loads of Africans were involved in it. It was way too dangerous for Europeans to travel too far inland because of diseases. The slaves were captured and brought to the ports by their fellow citizens. What about all the Arab slavers too? Every year, we pump $120 billion into countries, including probably years in foreign aid. I would stop that in a heartbeat if I could. I am fed up with being milked. Don't just delete this. Please pass it along to him. He's got the time. I saw his video about this on YouTube. Thanks, Robert. August 26, 2023, 4:19 p.m. From Robert to me. Good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I feel humbled to be asked to share some thoughts on the topic chosen for this evening's lecture. I say thoughts because I'm mindful, having participated in this lecture series for perhaps 17 or 18 of the 19 years, that at 7 o'clock in the evening, you probably don't want to be lecturing anybody. So I will share some thoughts. There are instances when I will indicate that it's my own personal opinion, and there are instances where I'm simply giving you views in the hope that we can have a conversation about reparations, republicanism, and the rule of law. The 3 R's: reparations, republicanism, and the rule of law. And it's perhaps not lost on me that the 4th R, Robert, who I just quoted to start the conversation, also starts with R. What next after 50 years of independence? I will leave reparations as the last bit to talk about. I will spend a little time on the rule of law, republicanism, and then reparations. I'm mindful that we have quite a few lawyers in the audience, but I'm also mindful that there are many non-lawyers in the audience. And I think I've quickly forgotten what it is to be a lawyer, so I would try to speak in as plain terms as I can on this concept of the rule of law. To a large extent, scholars, lawyers, legal academicians view the rule of law as the mechanism or the process or the institutions or the practice or the norms or the body of law upon which a state is founded that secures a form of government that is subject to and bound by the law. In contradistinction to a government or a power or an authority that is not subject to the law of the land or the law of the state. And to a large extent, this concept is perhaps most prevalent in what are called Western liberal democratic societies. And in the case of Grenada, for instance, and most of the Commonwealth Caribbean, it dates back to the United Kingdom and what is oftentimes viewed as the UK's own revolution when the Magna Carta was created. Prior to that, the United Kingdom had a system of absolute monarchy, which essentially meant that the king ruled with absolute power, with absolute discretion. And it was not until the Magna Carta that his power was curtailed or made subject to what eventually became the legislature or the UK Parliament in modern times. And essentially, the laws created by the UK Parliament curtailed or subjected the monarch and curtailed the powers of the monarch and subjected the monarch to the law of the land. And so the United Kingdom is now known as a constitutional monarchy with largely ceremonial powers and with the real decision-making power resting with the legislature. And the legal scholars will tell the non-legal scholars that the United Kingdom is peculiar in that it's one of the few modern liberal democracies that does not have a written constitution. In the liberal democracies that have a written constitution, there's an actual document that forms the basis for the organization of the state, and in many instances, the creation of the three main institutions that constitutes the state: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. In the case of the United Kingdom, the legislature is seen as all-powerful because it is not subject to a written constitution, and to some extent is perceived as having unfettered power to change and make law at will, as distinct from a legislature that has to make law or change law in accordance with a written constitution, as obtains in most of the former colonies of the United Kingdom within the Caribbean. So in the case of Grenada, for instance, we have a written constitution, we have a parliament that has to make law in accordance with the constitution and whose lawmaking process procedures are subject to being tested by the judiciary to ensure that it is made in accordance with the Constitution. Now, the idea of the rule of law, in a sense, recognizes that the society is going to be organized on certain fundamental assumptions. For example, that each individual should be treated fairly and equally before the law, that each individual should have the same access to the law, and that no individual, especially individuals who hold power, are above the rule of law. This requires a society to at least accept or acquiesce in such notions. If a society does not accept or acquiesce in such notions, then the entire concept of the rule of law becomes redundant or meaningless. And to some extent, Grenada is unique in the Caribbean in that Grenada had a system of governance and lawmaking, if we may call it that, for a period post its independence, which did not subscribe to this idea of a constitution, and perhaps did not subscribe, in some respects, to this idea that the society, and in particular the government, should be subject to this Western neoliberal concept of the rule of law. And so between the period 1979 to 1983, Grenada essentially was ruled by decree. And a decree is essentially a proclamation by anyone or any group of persons who have authority or the ability to, in fact, so proclaim and to ensure that the proclamation is enforced. And so we will recall that between 1979 and 1983, Grenada and the lawmaking power was vested in the Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and the Cabinet of Grenada. And I'm sure you would recall that the very first act, the very first proclamation, the very first decree was in fact to suspend the Constitution. And from then on, all of the laws that were passed were known as People's Law number 1, number 2, number 3, etc. Now, there are certain advantages to decree and proclamations. It's fast, it's effective, you don't have the constant back and forth, and more often than not, you can get things done at a far more efficient rate than under a parliamentary system. And so I'm asking the question, 50 years after independence, has the time come for us to seriously ask ourselves whether the concept of the rule of law, which exists in a Westminster-style democracy, which we have, is suited for a small nation-state like Grenada? Or are we better off with a system that allows those in power, we can talk about how they get to power, but those in power to rule by decree, to legislate by decree, to govern by decree? I've given some examples of the advantage of that. Its effectiveness, its swiftness, in many instances its certainty, and then followed up oftentimes by action. And so those who lived through the period of 79 to 83 can perhaps testify as to why that government was able to implement particularly its social programs and social policies at a rate far quicker than any government perhaps has since been able to, or any government did before. So I leave that question of what next and the conversation for us to have a bit later. But it's interesting because critics of this whole concept of the rule of law will point out that who is in power is perhaps more important than how they get into power. You see, the rule of law potentially spends a lot of time about the process by which one gets into power, rather than the question of whether the right people are getting into power. Because the wrong people could get into power perfectly legitimately. And what becomes of the society, what becomes of your country, is another question. And the world is replete with examples of persons who have gotten into power and who have governed and who did so perfectly under the rule of law. But their governance and how they've governed has been absolutely detrimental to the society that they govern. So there are many countries around the world which arguably does not subscribe to the notion of the rule of law as a basis for the establishment or the governance of a state or a society. And objectively, you may very well find that their citizens may in fact still have a better quality of life and may still enjoy greater freedoms than societies that are premised on the concept that the nation state must be governed by the rule of law. The rule of law also assumes, under Westminster parliamentarian-style democracy, that there will be an effective separation of powers, that the people who legislate, the people who are in the executive, and the people who are in the judiciary are going to be separate, are going to be distinct, and will carry out their functions distinctly. Now, in a pure theoretical sense, there are very few countries where this happens. Perhaps the United States of America is a classic example where it does happen. The people who sit in the legislature are not the people who sit in the executive, and the people who sit in the executive are not the people who sit in the judiciary. And they carry out their functions, all things being equal, independent of each other. In Grenada and many Commonwealth countries, that is not the case. The people who sit in the legislature and are the majority are the same people who sit in the executive. So there is no real or true separation of the legislature from the executive. And the idea that the people who sit in the executive are accountable to the legislature is in many instances a complete and total myth. And again, Grenada has proven this exception 3 times. In our post-independent history, we have created history by electing no opposition in Parliament. The effect of which is that the legislature became the executive and the executive became the legislature, certainly at the lower house of Parliament. And so even if you have the concept of the rule of law and the concept of the separation of powers, in reality, with no opposition in Parliament, there's no one to hold the executive accountable. There is no one for the executive to account to. And so the idea that there is a check on the power of the executive essentially becomes that of a myth. And so you could, in fact, even under a society that talks about the rule of law, that talks about the separation of power, end up, as we did, in a situation where the executive, save for the potential check that the judiciary may have on their lawmaking or on the decision-making via judicial review, that the executive could, in fact, end up with absolute power, or near absolute power. Because with a 15-0 majority in Parliament, you could create an absolutely new constitution, save for perhaps that one check of a referendum. And I see the Attorney General smiling. So I say this to say, if you had an executive that was popular enough, and perhaps wise enough, that you can convince the population to go with whatever issues you bring forward in a referendum, even under our Westminster-style democracy, even under a society that says we are governed by the rule of law, with a 15-0 majority in Parliament, and with sufficient support from the population, we could fundamentally alter the basis upon which the society is structured. And that includes eliminating, for example, the independence of the judiciary. So that is why I raised the question of, even in the context of the rule of law, even in the context of a Westminster-style democracy, if that creates a situation where you could, in fact, have absolute power in the hands of the executive and the legislature, whether the time has not come for us to seriously have a conversation as to whether or not that system of governance is more farcical than real. So I will leave that question for the what next 50 years after independence. This issue of republicanism is often spoken of in the context of breaking the chain or the link with our colonial past. And our Constitution clearly says that the Governor General is representative of Her Majesty, or in this case, His Majesty. And it's interesting because the Constitution does not explicitly say how the Governor General is to be appointed. It says who appoints the Governor General, but the how is left to convention. And the convention is that the Governor General is appointed on the advice of the Prime Minister. Our Constitution has around 61 references to the Prime Minister. It has 113 references to the Governor General. And the idea that we should become a republic, or the idea of republicanism, certainly in the Caribbean, has to a large extent been a conversation about removing the office of the Governor General and replacing it with that of, in brackets, a president. But does that really make a difference? My personal opinion is that it does not. And frankly, for small states, to me, it is cumbersome, expensive, and undemocratic. The separation of the head of state from the head of government is something that small islands can ill afford. Grenada spends approximately $1.7 million every year on the office of the Governor General. In 10 years, that's $17 million. In an island that struggles to meet the health needs and the education needs and the infrastructure needs of its citizens. Almost all of what is assigned to the Governor General can be performed by other offices that, in addition, provide real and substantive services to the people. And I can easily point out, for example, the Chief Justice or a judge of the High Court could easily perform all of the roles for the swearing in and all of that that is assigned to the office of the Governor General. But more fundamental, the idea of republicanism is that the head of government should be elected by the people and not be accountable to the legislature, but be accountable to the people. So in the United States, for example, the head of government, who is also the head of state, because there is no ceremonial president, is elected directly by the people. Albeit some may say that the electoral college is not direct election. But the president is not selected from the Congress. In our system, the Prime Minister is in fact selected from the Parliament by the Governor General. Because if you cannot command the majority in Parliament, you cannot become Prime Minister. And there is no better demonstration of the fact that you can have repeat Prime Ministers who are not elected by the people than in the United Kingdom. You've had several Prime Ministers, I've lost count now, who've governed this country, and they've not been elected by the people. They are effectively made and broken by the members of their party. And so you persist in having a ceremonial head of state, which is stable and handed down, and you have heads of governments who are not elected by the people and who are not accountable to the people, but in effect are accountable to a legislature. And you could have enough backdoor dealings that in fact the people who lead or become the head of government do not reflect the wishes of the people. And so even in the context of a Westminster-style system, one has to argue whether or not democracy actually happens. And so the idea of republicanism, if it is to be meaningful, to me, should reflect, one, no ceremonial head of state, certainly in small islands like Grenada. Two, whoever becomes head of state should be directly elected and be accountable to the people. And that means not being accountable to the legislature. That means the head of state or the head of the executive should be elected by the people. Those who wish to legislate can certainly also be elected by the people. And therefore, a truer form of republicanism is that which obtains in the United States. Of course, there are clear disadvantages to the United States system as well. And oftentimes you hear about the gridlock between the Congress and the office of the president. But one may argue that the gridlock is good because it forces you to negotiate and to compromise. And it checks arbitrariness, it checks absolute power, and it forces the parties to work together for the better good of the country. So in many of our Caribbean islands, we've had the conversations about the move to republicanism, Barbados being the latest. But in reality, all that we've done is replace the name Governor General with that of President. Dominica was the first to do it, or one of the first to do it. And similarly, you have a president that is also a ceremonial head of state. But all of the trappings that comes with the Governor General still exist. Trinidad and Tobago has done the same thing. You have a ceremonial president and you have a prime minister. The exception is the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, which in fact has an elected executive president. It also has a prime minister, but the president is the head of state and the head of government. And it's the only Commonwealth or former UK colony that has done so. And so there's an opportunity for us to examine the Guyana model and to see whether it has been effective for Guyana as compared with the rest of us who've continued, in a sense, by still having a parliamentarian Westminster-style system, notwithstanding the fact that we, or some of us, have simply switched the term from Governor General to that of President. Now, in a sense, all of what I've said comes obviously from our history of governance. It comes from a colonial, post-colonial era that goes all the way back to the Atlantic slave trade. And the fact that we have a Governor General who represents His Majesty is clear testimony to the lingering, unbroken bonds between, in the English-speaking Caribbean case, the United Kingdom and our former colonies. And that takes us into the conversation about reparations. And I started with a quote by Robert, because the reality is, perhaps 99% of persons who live in the UK may subscribe to and share Robert's view. And they're entitled to ask, what does this have to do with me? I did nothing wrong. And even if my ancestors did so 200 years ago, surely at some point in time, this must stop. And the question, therefore, is what is the response to this? The response, I think, first of all, is education. It was not so long ago. Grenada is only becoming an independent nation, or it's only celebrating its 50th anniversary of independence next year. That is not so long ago. If you are a colony of a country, it means that country has conquered and has subjugated you. It has colonized you. And the basis of the colonization was first genocide of the indigenous population, then the imposition of the Atlantic slave trade, and the organization of the society to enrich the colonizer. And that basic system remained in place, certainly all of the formal trappings of it, until these small islands began obtaining their independence. And we only started in the 1960s. So when the United Kingdom, for example, left the Caribbean, the vast majority of the population was illiterate. How are you going to produce a nation state with literate people? There was no education infrastructure to cater to the average citizen. There was no healthcare system to cater to the average citizen. The economy was still designed to trade with the colonizer and to extract raw materials to supply by then what was already the third or fourth industrial revolution that was taking place in Europe and the United Kingdom. So the consequences of 200 years of slavery is 400 years of exploitation that has left us still largely underdeveloped, poor, marginalized, and subject now to disasters and threats created by your industrialization, in particular, the threats associated with climate change. So the conversation is about, using a UK term, leveling up and making good that which you made not good. It's a conversation about how do we ensure that, one, something like the Atlantic slave trade never happens again. And that is why the CARICOM 10-point plan on reparations starts with this issue of an apology. It doesn't start with asking for money or for material things. It starts with asking for an acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. And if 200 to 400 years removed from it, you have difficulty in saying it was wrong, then it says you do not think it was wrong. Then it says, if given the chance, it will happen again. And lest we forget, because we see that in November a lot, there's the British Virgin Islands. It's not an independent state. And in fact, last year, the UK threatened to impose direct rule on the British Virgin Islands. So the idea that colony and colonizer no longer exist, there's clear evidence that it exists. The idea that the inequality does not exist and that we should sweep it under the carpet, there is clear evidence that it exists. And so the conversation about reparations is not a conversation about black versus white. It is not only a conversation about slavery. It is also a conversation about genocide, and specifically genocide of the indigenous populations of the region. When Europeans visited this region, there were millions of indigenous people alive. Today, there's probably less than 250,000 of them living. They are the most marginalized. They have the shortest life expectancy. They succumb to the most disease and are almost forgotten, including by the descendants of persons who were enslaved. And so we have to appreciate that reparations is not just about descendants of African slaves, but it is also about the genocide that was committed against the indigenous population and the several hundreds of them who are left alive today and who are still paying the price for having been marginalized over the last several centuries. We also need to appreciate that most of the Caribbean countries are heavily indebted because, upon attaining independence, they had no resources within which to carry out, for example, the mass literacy programs they needed, to invest in healthcare, education, infrastructure development. So to do so, they borrowed. And they borrowed from multilateral institutions that are controlled by their former colonizers. And they borrowed at expensive interest rates and oftentimes on terms and conditions that destabilize both politically and socially their countries. And now we borrow to rebuild after we get hit by the hurricanes. So when a hurricane wipes out more than 100% of your GDP, as a country, you actually have nothing. In 6 hours, everything goes. And you have to start. And what do? You borrow. And where are you borrowing from? Your former colonizers. So it is not purely a conversation about race. I think we have certainly shown that we are perhaps the most tolerant people on planet Earth. I think most other places in the world could benefit from visiting the Caribbean and learning about tolerance. But what we cannot tolerate is the idea that we should not fight for justice, is the idea that we should accept that notwithstanding that we've gained our independence, that's all that matters, that we've cut you loose and you're on your own. And fundamentally, we should never accept the idea that owning another human being is acceptable. Because you cannot have a state, a nation state, that is founded on the rule of law, that is founded on the basis of equality, if one human being could own another human being. And so when we speak of what next for the next 50 years, the fundamental question is that to remain a nation state, this fundamental premise that slavery, that chattel slavery, specifically slavery based on race or color, is something that should never be accepted or tolerated. And if there's one reason for keeping the rule of law, or if there's one thing that we should enshrine in the rule of law, is that another human being should never be permitted to own another human being, domestically and internationally. And I will conclude by saying the rule of law matters internationally, perhaps even more so than sometimes domestically. Because if not, what you would have is might is right. And it is the same might that is right that led to the Atlantic slave trade. So internationally, we need a rules-based system that subjects the mighty as well as the tiny to the rule of law, to ensure that the mighty doesn't enslave the tiny. And so, as a small, tiny nation, it's imperative for us that as we go forward in the next 50 years, that the fight for reparation, that the fight for a system of government which we may call republicanism, that is more reflective of our society, and to ensure that the likes of Robert would understand that I'm not trying to milk him. That is because we are tolerant that he could leave the United Kingdom and come to Grenada, specifically Carriacou, buy land in Carriacou, and have the freedom to express himself in the manner in which he did to me. So, here concludes my little conversation. I'm happy to be part of the discussion. Mr. President and others, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for that most enlightening address, which has given us much food for thought. At this time, we will open the floor to questions to the Prime Minister, and I'll take the liberty of switching seats with the President so that I can be a little bit closer to the Prime Minister. And so we'll open the floor for questions, and in the interest of time and to facilitate as many questions as possible, we ask, I see you, Brother Jerry, immediately. We ask that if you have comments as opposed to questions, we keep the comments for the end, but we keep the questions first. I'll open the floor to you, Brother Jerry. And please indicate by raise of hand so that we can see you, or make your way up to the mic. Thank you.
Thank you, grateful, and pleasant good afternoon to my Prime Minister, my President of the Bar, and my colleagues here, and a love supreme to everyone here. Good afternoon, members of the Bar and the general public. Mr. Prime Minister, I wonder what your thoughts are on the lack of democracy, say, for example, at CARICOM. You know, there's a discussion about a Caribbean parliament, and as you know, the framework is actually set out for a Caribbean parliament. You were speaking of the one voice, the single voice within the governance structure, where, for example, the executive can be the legislature and likely marginalize other governing structures within the state. I'd like to hear your comment on whether you think CARICOM, or whether it's not time, rather, for CARICOM to institute a parliament in which all the political players get to participate in decision-making in the region. We can look at the OECS, for example. There's talk of an OECS parliament, but perhaps you put a lot of ink in that milk already, right? With the recent brouhaha in St. Lucia. I don't want to talk about that. CARICOM. It seems that Caribbean leaders themselves get two bites of the apple. They're the leaders at home, they go to CARICOM, they're the leaders in CARICOM with no other voice. I'd like to hear your thoughts about democratizing CARICOM. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, I think it really has to do with whether we can get greater political cohesion in CARICOM to actually create institutions like this. So we could use the European Union as an example. You actually have a European Union Parliament, and that, to some extent, that does not take away from the fact that you still have your individual domestic parliaments. It would require politicians, because part of the challenge with our system of politics is that when you're in opposition, you support or you oppose things, and when you get to government, you turn around and the very thing you were supporting, you either oppose, or the very thing that you were opposing, you support. And oftentimes the expediency of wanting to retain power drives almost all of the decision making. So I think we, as a society, we have to get to a point where, and I think that's one of the challenges, and I think it's gotten worse actually in the last 20 or 25 years. You can't change a society only through politicians. In fact, you're probably not going to change it through politicians. We have to get to the point where the rest of the Caribbean civilization, Employers Federation, trade unions, Chamber of Commerce, business groups, students, universities in particular, talk and advocate for the kind of societies we want. I think we all know that the people who have power never give up the power. You, to a large extent, have to take the power from them. So unless we get to a point where there is agitation, where students coming out of university are talking about things like a OECS parliament or CARICOM parliament, the likelihood that a leader will say, let us advocate to lessen or weaken my power, once in a while you may find someone like that. But generally, you get into the system and the system will continue chugging along. So I think we have to get to the point where there's a lot more advocacy coming out of the education system, coming out of the academia, to actually start talking about what kind of Caribbean society we want 50 years from now. We don't have sufficient of these kinds of conversations. We need to have a lot more of that. And I think our universities in particular, now, sometimes people don't like hearing that. But the universities ought to be a hotbed of activism, ought to be a hotbed of ideas, ought to be a hotbed of revolution. I think it used to be perhaps coming out of, in a sense, the immediate post-colonial period, but we are creating universities where all we are frankly preaching is, or it seems to me the underlying value system is materialism, where the first thought is how well I can do materially rather than how well can I change or improve the society. To me, that's what education should do. It should make you want to say, okay, I've reviewed this, this isn't working, we can do better, and let's go in a different direction. So I certainly think conversations like OECS Parliament, CARICOM Parliament, how we decentralize power, how we actually get CARICOM to implement decisions that are made, is the kind of stuff that our universities or colleges should be pushing. Because if you can push those ideas when you're in university, you will get to power someday. And it will be a good opportunity for you to implement the sort of ideals that you were championing. But if our universities are not creating that kind of ideology, then essentially means when you come out, you just fall in line and you continue like everybody else.
There was a question from, sorry, sir, there was a question from this gentleman at the back with the white hair. Or is it?
Wisdom, Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Maybe they can just line up. So we go
Yes. And you can please line up if you want to ask your question so that we have an efficient,
I only hope we
orderly.
don't follow the American model, because in some states, the ownership of one individual by another still exists. But my question is, in order for us to avoid 15-0, where the executive become the legislature, or whatever you call it, have we thought about proportional representation? And the other question is, I would suggest that we look at the Singapore model of democracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think it was a question. I think the comment is that, one, we could consider proportional representation as obtains in Guyana, as opposed to a situation of whoever wins the seat, the one majority, because all you need is 50 plus 1, and you win, and the other 49 essentially gets forgotten, that we can look at a model where both the 51 and the 49 are represented. And the second comment was that we can look at the Singapore model of democracy. And I will certainly say it is worth looking at, because part of the challenge with a democratic Westminster-style system is it creates instability, particularly when it comes to policy and implementation of policy. So this government says we're building a hospital. If you can't do it in your 5-year term, the next government comes and says no hospital. 5 years later, the government changes, you have to start all over again. Notwithstanding that the policy initiative may be good. So part of the challenge we face is how do we get governance that could allow for change in personnel, but can at the same time ensure that we continue policies that are clearly good for the nation, regardless of who thought about it or regardless of whose idea it was first. I think that's one of the challenges we have with our competitive Westminster-style system of government. And the other countries, Singapore, for example, you may perhaps say China is perhaps the modern-day classic, because you've had changes in leadership of China. The presidents have changed. But what you've had is a system where clearly the policy, the development plan have been followed, regardless of who the president is. I'm just using that as an example. And there are other countries where that has happened.
I believe we had a question from the, thank you.
Good evening, or good night. Standing on the protocol established, my question, Mr. Prime Minister, you spoke about the Republicanism and the ceremonial role of the Governor General and the President. My question would be, if we were to adopt the process where they're both elected, what would be the check and balance? Would that be the referendum? What is the thought process? Should we determine, okay, we have a president and a prime minister. What would be our check and balance?
Okay, good question. So let me say my personal view. I don't think you need a president and a prime minister in a small place like Grenada. And I don't think most Caribbean nations need it. Having said that, there is one example where it exists, which is Guyana. There is a prime minister and there is a president. Places like Kenya, there's a president and a prime minister. To some extent in Kenya, the prime minister is essentially the president's secretary, for want of a better word. And the prime minister essentially is a cabinet minister, really, that does the bidding of the president. So in that case, there's really no need for a check and balance because they're part and parcel of the executive. There are other countries where you have a president who elects or selects a prime minister from parliament, and the parliament, well, elects both the prime minister and the cabinet from the parliament, and the parliament has to sanction or approve it. And that prime minister and that cabinet then carries out to a large extent a lot of the work, the executive work. If the president wants to sack the prime minister, for example, he has to get the permission or the concurrence of the parliament. There are some European countries, particularly Eastern European countries, where that system exists. So it is possible to have a situation where you have a president who's elected by the people, you have a legislature, and the president selects a prime minister from the legislature with the sanction of the legislature as well as the other ministers, and they form the cabinet and implement the policies that the president wants to implement. If the president is of the view that they're not performing in the manner or at the level he desires, he can sack them. Usually, though, that sacking will require majority support in parliament. If it doesn't, then you end up with oftentimes a constitutional crisis, and you may have a situation where you don't have a cabinet. And in situations like that, the president oftentimes may rule by decree, because the Constitution may give him residual powers to ensure that the country continues functioning, even while they find a prime minister. So it is possible to have that check or balance where you still give the legislature the say in saying, yes, we support this prime minister and the cabinet who the president is selecting.
Of the checks and balance you've mentioned so far, it seemed to include mostly the process of the persons already elected. Where would we place the daily need or the changing needs of the electorate themselves? How are we on the ground with what they would want us to do?
Well, I think in most democracies you have a validation period. It ranges from 4 to 5 years. So if you're elected, I mean, surely you have to give the person you elect some time to perform. Mm-hmm. And if they're not performing, then you know you're coming back to the polls in 4 or 5 years' time. And in those circumstances, you certainly can speak very clearly as to whether you approve or disapprove. To a large extent, I think we always see that elections are really referendum on the government, because essentially if people are happy with the performance, they tend to elect them. But in some legal constitutional setup, including in the United States at a state level, for example, you have the ability to recall people who are elected. So governors, for example, in many states can be recalled if sufficient people are prepared to sign or go on the ballot to say we are not happy. And it triggers essentially a referendum or a vote on whether or not the elected officials should be recalled. In the United States, judges are also elected in many states. So you essentially have an election even for the judiciary. And the judicial officers can be recalled similarly if you have persons who are dissatisfied and can get sufficient support. So there are these options that one could consider. The truth is oftentimes they are not something that happens often because you would obviously have to be able to galvanize and get sufficient support for it to happen. And then it's one thing to recall. When you recall a person, oftentimes the deputy or the person underneath will then have to serve until you can then have a fresh election to elect someone. So there is that possibility. And I'm sure if the population of Grenada and the Caribbean, and if we continue to have public conversations about the type of governance structure that best suits us, questions about whether we should have built into our constitutional or legal framework the ability to recall elected officials is something that we can certainly have a discussion on. I would probably say to you, now that I'm an elected official, that the ability to implement effective policy, certainly in our current construct, is extremely difficult in 4 and 5 years. And so you add on top of that the ability to recall people, and then you may very well find a situation where all you're doing is you're in election and campaigning and recalling mode all the time. And so nothing really gets done in terms of effective policy. But people may argue that by having these things in place, it may force people to be a lot more effective and to deliver a lot more. But that depends on a number of other things probably taking place. Thank you.
I'd appreciate it. So my other question, last question on the reparations. I think it's a general consensus by the majority of my colleagues and colleagues in Grenada, the Caribbean, wider world, that reparations should take place by us West Indians. We believe that. How would we divide reparations? You spoke about the indigenous population being affected a certain way, and we have certain countries having slavery having different impacts. Some of them having greater economic benefits from slavery, for example, Barbados and the Barbados economy, and their proximity to the Westminster system and England. How do you propose we're able to competently assess a way to equitably or share the reparations, should that ever happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would say it will happen. We live long enough to see things completely reversed in time. We can perhaps just take conversations about the impact of tobacco and how powerful the tobacco companies were. And it's lawyers who brought the tobacco companies to their knees. When nothing else failed, they got sued repeatedly, and eventually they succumbed. It's probably going to be lawyers who are going to have to take the reparations issue to where we need it to go. And so part of the plan of CARICOM is to get an advisory council, for example, advisory opinion, for example, from the ICJ. We intend to approach OCBA and other legal organizations so that particularly young lawyers can get involved in this fight. We intend to take this to the United Nations to make sure that this becomes on the agenda of the United Nations. We intend to partner with the African Union to make sure this becomes on the agenda of the African Union. Slavery didn't end because the enslavers got up one day and decided that they had a moral conscience. Decolonization didn't start because one day the colonizers woke up and decided, all right, we've had enough and we've extracted enough from you so we can leave you to be. As I said, don't ever get the notion that powerful people will allow you to take their power. The idea of reparations, certainly I think from a CARICOM perspective, is not asking for a pot of gold. We're not asking for you to come and just simply hand to individual countries $1 billion or $2 billion and say divide it amongst your citizens. That is not what we're asking for. We can perhaps start with the last of the 10-point plan, which is the whole question of our debt and the debts we've incurred to try and build our civilization. So cancelling of that debt, for example, would automatically mean in the case of Grenada that the hundreds of millions of dollars that we spend every year in debt repayment will now be able to be spent on the development of Grenada. And that applies to all Grenadians. So the ability to enhance your education, your social services, your healthcare, your infrastructure happens then equally to all of us. And I can use that as a simple example. Ensuring that we can deal with the climate crisis is another example. Ensuring that when the hurricanes hit, we don't have to continue paying the debt, but we can use our resources to build back will apply to all of us. Because if the bridge washes away, or the carronage sinks, it means all of us can't use the carronage. All of us can't get from St. Andrew to St. David. I want us to appreciate the vulnerability of much of our infrastructure. If you're driving on the Eastern Main Road, and any of these bridges go, you can't move from St. George's to St. Andrew or from St. Andrew to St. David. It's as simple as that. And for places like Dominica, when they had the hurricanes, many of the villages were only accessible via helicopter. So you could have people trapped for days with no food, no water, and no help. So, as I said, this is not a case where we are saying simply hand us billions of dollars. We should be doing that. But we are saying that there are sensible things that could be done that will enhance the ability of all nations to be able to take care of ourselves and not have to come to you cap in hand, not have to come to you begging or pleading. And that is the leveling up that we want. We want there to be a fair playing field that would allow the Caribbean to go from developing countries into developed countries. And to a large extent, we could only do so by focusing on things like education, by focusing on things like healthcare. If you have a healthy population and an educated population, then you will be able to compete with the rest of the world. So that is really the sort of equality or the factors that we are looking at when we speak about reparations.
Gentleman in the, thank you.
Good evening to the head table. Good evening to all. Mr. Prime Minister, you have the ability to stimulate the imagination, and that's a great ability. But the imagination is one thing and the reality is the next. You have spoken about the idea that we find it difficult to separate the powers within our system, within our Westminster system, that the legislature and the executive does get itself tied up. Are you committed to ensuring that within your 5-year tenure, that steps will be taken to untie the executive and the legislature? That means, in essence, are you committed to us going through the process of a referendum and a constitutional change where we can have a constitution of the people, by the people, and for the people? I think our politicians also want the constitution of the politicians. So are you committed to having a constitution reform within your tenure? I'll stop here.
So the first answer I'll give you is a political one. As you said, commitment is one thing, reality is another. So let's deal with the reality of the current constitutional construct. You have to have a supermajority in Parliament to start talking about constitutional change. Or you have to have an opposition that is prepared to agree with you on constitutional change. And therefore, you have to have both the government of the day and the opposition being genuine. In the absence of that, it will not work. And we've seen it. In the absence of a publicly agreed and stated commitment by all political parties, or at least the two main ones in our system, to engage in constitutional reform or revolution, and to jointly sit at the table together and to engage the public, it will not happen. So I wouldn't waste my time by trying to create constitutional reform from a government perspective alone. It simply will not work because we will not have the majority in Parliament, and more crucially, the other side is going to play political football and their supporters then will not want to support it. So it would require joint, open, public, I would call explicitly agreed in writing. That's the only way in which I can see us moving forward on this question. And the reason I say so is because I will be very clear. My idea, and that's why I say constitutional revolution, I actually think our government is too expensive, it is too cumbersome, it is too slow, and it is too bureaucratic. There's just simply too much government for small islands like Grenada. And so it requires, in my view, a dramatically simplified form of governance that is more direct, more flexible, more nimble, and more adaptable. With all due respect, all of I mean, for example, we have a bicameral legislature. Upper house, lower house, completely separate. Their processes are separate. And I'll give you a simple example. So to pass a bill, if you had one house, everybody's sitting, you debate, the majority say yes, we move. We don't have this system. In the lower house, we debate, the majority say, okay, we're ready. You have to send it up to the upper house. That could be a month, it could be 2 weeks, it could be what have you. You have the back and forth. If it then pass in muster, it could come back down to the lower house. By then, if the politicians in government are busy, etc., they can't put it on their schedule. Parliament doesn't sit for another 3-4 months. Whatever policy initiative you're trying to get, that gets thrown by the wayside, something else takes it over. So the reality is, in my view, the constitutional change is not really a conversation about replacing the Governor General with the President. Barbados has done that, and what has happened? Nothing. Trinidad has done it, nothing. We all face the same challenges. It's probably worse to pass legislation in places like Trinidad or Barbados than even in Grenada. So the constitutional change, the conversation about the constitution by and for the people requires, in my view, deep fundamental conversations. It requires education, and it requires providing options. It requires actually saying to people, there's the Westminster style, there's the American style, there's the Singaporean model, there's the Chinese model, there's the PRG model. Let us talk about all of them, let us educate ourselves about, and then decide whether one or combination of them is better suited for us. That requires deep educating, public consciousness, and a willingness for the political parties to sit down face to face together and have those conversations. If that is not going to happen, we probably would have 200 referenda and nothing will pass, because whoever is in opposition will say, I ain't supporting it because they just don't want the government to achieve something, and when the government goes into opposition, they will continue the same thing. So I have said this, so my answer is it is unlikely in 5 years, well, no, it's 3.5 years, that the question of what I call constitutional revolution will get to a ballot box issue. But from an education point of view, and from having the conversation about what type of government we need for Grenada over the next 50 years, I'm happy to have the conversation and to be an advocate for that process. And I hope you will be an advocate for that process too, sir.
I believe we had another question from the back.
Good evening. I have a comment rather than a question, so should I wait or?
Proceed.
All right, thank you. I'd like to say thanks to the Prime Minister for his presentation, but I also like to say thanks to the President of the Bar, that's Mr. Derek, and also to the person who introduced the Prime Minister, Mr. Andel. Mr. Derek spoke about the need for us to act today. I'm also very much heartened by the Prime Minister speaking about our indigenous heritage. It is something that we tend to sometimes throw away, and we don't really tend to appreciate. So as we sit in Camohon Park, which is part of our heritage, indigenous heritage, and if we just look across the road, we also have Koyaba Hotel, which is part of our indigenous heritage, meaning heavenly body. We are sitting, you could say, on water, because all this place here was the sea. But it was also one of the most important trading posts in the entire Caribbean, where our indigenous people brought in from South America, Tobago, Trinidad, Brazil, a lot of precious, semi-precious stones, plant material, seeds encapsulated in tar. Some came from a pitch lake in Trinidad and so. I'm saying all this to say, because if we just go next door, if we look within this space, within this environmental space, we can live, as Mr. Derek said today, we can live right now and go out to Camohon Park and see where some work has been done. And it's been done in that space. And I don't think that maybe enough due diligence was made in just exposing such an important area. Because if we live right now and go there, we can actually see the remains of our indigenous people just lying there unprotected. But you said some very important thing as education. We need that education process as much as our indigenous heritage, our reparation, our heritage itself, because in a matter of days, we can say, we will be entering 2024 when the focus will be, part of the focus will be on the indigenous heritage, the black people. The UN has declared 2024 as the year for people of African descent. And many countries have programs, they have things laid out to be done, and I'm not certain as to what we are doing here in Grenada. But we're heading for 50, so we could plan for 50 years more. So we need to bring those things as part of the process so that the younger persons and younger generation and those who come, they too understand what happened before, because the present depends on the past for future development. So it's my comment. I mean, it's a tall order, and we all can do it just at a stroke of a pen, but it'll take some doing. So I trust that as we go forward to the next 50, some of those issues we can at least start addressing. Thank you.
I know it was a comment, but do you have anything to say in response?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Jessamy. So sometimes it's, I don't want us to be too hard on ourselves sometimes. We have to take things into context. We're only 50 years old from an independent perspective, but our civilization is hundreds of years old. But those who lived on the island and those who governed were not the same. Those who governed lived off island. And so when that happens, the ability to appreciate your history, as in the entire 300 or 400 years, for those who are on the island, it's not that simple, because those who govern and were off the island would have taken a different approach to it. And I'm flagging this because I can give you an example. I just came from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's a country that, in a sense, has a history as a nation of about 400 years. The Prime Minister of that country is now seeking to rebuild 400 years after the city where the country was founded. And in fact, that is where he hosted us. The question is, why now? One may simply be, you don't have the resources to do it. Or combined with the resources to do it, you now have the ideology, the mentality, the appreciation for your history. And so sometimes you have to go through these processes. Now, in the context of the Caribbean, you'd appreciate that those who rule us did not necessarily want us to have an appreciation for indigenous history. So it's 50 years later, we are only now beginning to look at that. The question of planning. Now, it's one thing, obviously, to recognize you need independence because the people who are ruling you just don't care. It's another thing now to then plan what kind of society we want to create. And I think that is part of what we in the Caribbean now need to appreciate. That there would have been, in a sense, perhaps a passionate, emotional cry for political independence. We now have to focus on what kind of society we want to create 50, 100, 150 years from now, have the conversation with our populations, teach what kind of society we want in our schools, so that 50 years from now, the students know that is what we are working on, that is the road they will travel, that is where we want to go. So the idea of the society is not for the politician. We have to ask ourselves what kind of Grenadian we want 50 years from now. Do you want a Grenadian that's bilingual? Do you want a Grenadian that understands that our history doesn't start 50 years ago? That our history and our ancestors' history didn't start when the Europeans came to the Caribbean? I could be wrong, but I wasn't taught any African history when I went to school. I wasn't taught any Asian history. And I certainly wasn't taught any history about Arabia or the Middle East. What I was taught was Cristobal, what is the Jamaican? No, the Jamaicans are, the Jamaican artist Cristobal Columbus, I think is how we call him, born in Spain. Came, he saw these people and he thought he was in the East. They had long straight hair, so he realized he's not in the East, he's in West India. They brought disease, they enslaved them, they took the lands, they went to Africa, brought people here, enslaved them, plantation economy. And then from the 1920s, 30s, because people went to fight in World War I and World War II, we got exposed to the notion of freedom and human dignity and individual freedom. And then we started agitating for improvements in the conditions of the laborers on the plantations, et cetera, et cetera. It led to trade union movements and then the fight for independence. So the planet, the only reference outside of that is the Bible that says, well, actually life began before Christopher Columbus. That is what we have taught our people for hundreds of years. I mean, that's not a flat view of the world. That's a, I don't even know what world. That's a one-dimensional view of reality. So the idea that people will start having appreciation for Amerindian art and so on, Amerindian history and so on, is something that requires a complete, in a sense, vacuuming of our mind and repopulating it with the reality about the globe, about the history of Asia, the history of the Middle East, the real history of the Europeans, the real history of Africa. And our education system is not even remotely attempting to do so, in my respectful view. And that actually perpetuates oftentimes that kind of inferiority complex that is still pervasive in the Caribbean. So you don't have a global picture. And if you don't have a global picture, then how are you going to compete on the globe? How are you going to create a society that is global, that sees itself as equal to Arabia, to Africa, to Asia, to North America, to Europe? That is the part of the challenge we have. So I'm saying, and that's why I go on and on about education. But there's an opportunity now that we probably never had before. And that's called internet. That's called technology. You can find out anything about anyone, anywhere, any culture, almost at any time. And we have to be able to utilize those tools so that the current and the next generation of Caribbean people understand that the world is not as prescribed by the Europeans. And that is in fact dramatically different. And that there are successful continents, successful countries, now and in the past, all over the world, and that the civilization of humanity was not built by Europeans. It was built by mankind, all over the world, in all different parts of the world, in all different continents. And if we do that, then I think people in the Caribbean will begin to appreciate their own role in all of that. So I'm saying all of this to say, Mr. Jesme, I agree with you.
With that, if there is one last question. And while Ms. Taylor makes her way to the mic, may we acknowledge the presence, belatedly, I apologize, of the Registrar of the High Court, Ms. Shamara Cherubin Forsyth, and other members of staff of the Supreme Court Registry. Yes, Ms. Taylor, the last question is yours.
Yes, good night. Madam Moderator, I seek your permission to disobey you slightly, because my question really is whether Plan 2030-2035, but I have to put that in a certain context. First, thank you, Prime Minister, for a rather provocative lecture. I listened to you earlier bemoaning the fact, and any student of political science would be mindful of that the device of the 5-year electoral cycle militates against long-term planning. And I wondered if you can conceive of a way in which something like a Plan 2030, I think it was changed to 2035, and I have to say I haven't heard much of that since your government took office, can be given some teeth in some way to preserve good policy, to survive the change of government. I wondered if that's something that has been considered, and I wondered, what has happened to Plan 2035? And because it was meant to absorb the aspirations through consultations of our nation state and reflect it in a developmental plan that was meant to survive the vicious 5-year cycle.
Thank you for the comment and question. I would say that Plan 2035 is very much alive. In fact, I think all of our government's policies come straight out of Plan 2035. And certainly from a decision-making perspective, the cabinet template itself requires the ministries, when making submissions to cabinet, to identify how the particular submission fits within the context of Plan 2035. I will probably admit that we need to do far more advocacy on it. And that's why I talked about the schools, because I think that's really the starting point from an education point of view. But I conceive, for instance, that Plan or Vision 2035 could be legislated. That we can take the plan to Parliament, enact it into law, and say, governments, that is the roadmap, that is the plan, and you would have to demonstrate, and we can write in what that demonstration is, if you wish to deviate or change from that plan. How detailed we go with it could be something we can debate, but I certainly think high-level issues, for example, we can agree and legislate. And I'll give an example, education. And the need to, in my view, radically alter the education system in Grenada and the Caribbean. And I'm unapologetic about it. CXC, in my view, has significant work to do. So I'm going to say something. If I had my way, I'm not so sure Grenada would be part of the CXC. And no, I'm saying it. All we focus on is credentials. It makes absolutely no sense. And so when I talk about things that, in my view, that matter, if you're bilingual, as far as I'm concerned, that's more important than if you have all this thing behind your name. If you can swim, that is more important than if you have all these things behind your name. If you are digitally literate, that is 10 times more important than all the stuff behind your name. And if you understand the importance of your health, and you need to exercise, you need to eat properly, so that you don't really need to ever end up in the general hospital or all these places, that to me is 50 times more important than all of this other stuff that we're piling on our children. And I'm saying, to me, that is the kind of stuff the education system needs to focus on. And we are not. And instead, you have people crying about whether the child go to convent or SAS. This is the kind of thing we're perpetuating. So to me, the need to have an education system that creates the skill set, that creates the confidence, and that teaches you your role in the world, i.e. the history of mankind, the history of humanity, that is the kind of thing that, to me, we can legislate. Ensure that each young person does volunteer service on behalf of the state, mandatory volunteerism. Each young person has the opportunity to learn a second language. Ensure that we stay in school until 18, because you're not you're not an adult until you're 18, and then we're letting kids out of school at 14 and 15 and telling them to fend for themselves. And we expect them not to get into trouble, we expect them not to be poor. Well, if at 16 you're out of school and you don't have a job, what becomes of you? So to me, those things can be legislated as part of the overall plan, and the electorate then will have the ability to hold the political parties and hold the governments to task by saying, if we agreed in the 2035 plan that we would make skills training mandatory, that we will make learning a second language mandatory, that we would have volunteerism in the education system, we can go on, and it's not being done, then the government is acting illegally. And there should be consequences for the illegal activity of the government outside of just losing office. So that is something that I think that can be done. And if it's certainly, in my view, a creative way to look at how you start actually having not just the policy, but the implementation of policies that we accept should not change simply because there's a change in the personality in the particular office. So I hope that's the only thing I can come up with as a possible answer to ensure that we have a buffer against the change in whims of politicians who come and go as they see fit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Certainly. Dr. Williams, there's a mic right here.
Good evening. I want to thank the Bar Association for this lecture. I have come to some over the years, not all, so whenever I come, it seems to be strategically valuable to me. And I want to thank the Prime Minister for what someone has called a rather provocative presentation. He said he was not going to give us a lecture. I think not only it's not particularly provocative to me, but it's very visionary and inspiring in the sense that, and I wasn't going to speak, but your last response helped me get back to what I've been thinking about all night as I listened to you. You critique the education system as one that I would characterize as focused on credentializing rather than giving sort of meaningful content and skills to the young person. It's not either or. It has to be, in my view, a balance of both. But at the moment, it's predominantly that. I got 14 subjects, I got 11 subjects, and these persons can't hold a conversation. They don't know how to treat their grandmother or their neighbor, and so on and so on. So I think you are correct in proposing that the education system needs a revolutionary review to include content, what I would call content, meaningful living content, and not just as a procedural exercise. So take that analogy all the way back to the start of your lecture about the rule of law. This notion of the rule of law seems to me it has been a series of procedures that we should vote, that we should do certain lawmaking exercises without and what was missing, or what remains missing, is the concern about how it impacts the society, and particularly those in need of protection or support. Which brings me to say to you that I'm one of those who've come through the revolution and would be happy to give you greater guidance. It seems to me that you're asking for it, not just for you, but for the society, as to perhaps how we can craft something more valuable and meaningful to us. We got a lot wrong in the revolution. I'll be the first to say that. I've said that since 1983. But I'm also the one who says we got a lot of it right. And I'm very proud of what we got right. And I believe that it can guide us into the next 50 years. So perhaps tonight, part of what the nation can hear is that we ought not to be afraid to analyze and embrace the parts of the revolution for the next 50 years that hold a promise, just a promise, of taking us into a content-rich society or a practice. I'm happy to be president of the Senate, but if you look at the history of that, that is a position that was held by male elites who were there to supervise the interests of the plantocracy. And we've come a long way in getting, local people, women, and so on to hold it. But it needs a complete revolution in what it means. What does it mean to be president of the Senate? What can the Senate do to advocate not just lawmaking, but appropriate lawmaking and transformation in the society? So I will go away, Mr. President of the Bar Association, and Prime Minister, and all those associated with tonight. I will go away with a renewed confidence that our past, particularly around the revolution, but other elements of it, can be an infusion into the next 50 years, in particular reference to some of the deficits we had. And the last point I would say is that the people's laws were called that. They were not just decrees. They were based on something that your government is doing now, which is the consultation with people. They emerged out of what seemed to have a majority interest in the country. Sure, there were unique things that the NJM and the party executive and Maurice Bishop and so wanted done. But I think that if we examine the people's laws regarding education and transportation and food and sovereignty and so on, it really expressed a certain, what I continue to call a content-rich aspirations of the people. And therefore, it was perhaps morally and socially legitimate at the time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I talked about the People's Law. I was using the word decree more in the context of sort of the academic, I guess, definitions of the process for lawmaking. But I spoke about it specifically because I actually wanted this. I wanted us to recognize that as much as we talk about the parliamentary style of governance and lawmaking, that Grenada specifically, more than any place else in the English-speaking Caribbean, has had an opportunity to have a completely different system of lawmaking. And therefore, the what next was meant to say, we need to therefore examine just that. Examine the pros, and I deliberately spoke about the pros because to me the cons were obvious. No checks and balances, the misuse of the power, because you could in fact pass a law that says tomorrow the house that was privately owned by me became that of the PRG government, and in fact that happened. I mean, people like Derek Knight, specific legislation that was used to confiscate and take his property. So obviously, I didn't highlight the negatives because I think they're obvious and well known. But the reality is, and that's why I talk about a simplified version of lawmaking. And I think the People's Law is a perfect example of that. And many of the People's Law survived and are part of our law today and are some of the more progressive pieces of legislation that we have on it. And I'm giving examples. You know, we joined the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank under the People's Law. The PRG, NIS, for example, was created under the People's Law. A lot of the social benefits that employees have, in fact, almost every statutory quasi-government entity that has a profit-sharing element for employees, rightly or wrongly, came out of the revolution and the policies and practices that they implemented. So I certainly think that we ought to do just that. We ought to go away looking at what things worked in the past and how can we marry all of that to get to a point where the political system, the legal system, is more reflective of creating the kind of society that we want. And my provocative comments on CXC was not to suggest that quality and testing and measurement isn't important. It's really to say that that is seemingly all we do, even when it's clear that we are facing significant shortages of skills across the board in almost every facet of our daily lives. And it is significantly handicapping not just the economic, but I think the social development of the country as well. And so that is something that we have to be able to not just talk about, but be able to tackle. And oftentimes, you know, the people who are the gatekeepers of education, you know, if we can't get them to buy in and can't get them to change, the education system is not going to change. But that's the nature of change. You know, oftentimes you're asking the people who need the change most. They're the ones who resist the change the most. So that's part of the challenge that we face. And that's why I think it's important to project not just a 5-year, but a 10, 15, 20, 25-year plan, because some of those things are so deeply embedded in our fabric that it will take significant time to make some of the changes. But thank you very much, and I certainly look forward to, sorry if you needed to respond, the mic is there. I certainly look forward to I think that Grenada and the Caribbean, we need a lot more of this. So let me use the opportunity to say thank you to the President of the Bar Association for insisting that I deliver this lecture. We need to conversate more about what kind of society we want. And I think we would find that the more we do that, the easier it is to lift the conversation and the easier it is to lift the society. And we should not, you see, there's a vacuum, then there's always Movilang and Bacchanal and Comes that will fill the vacuum. But if we are conversating, if we are consulting, if we are discussing, if we are having more of this, then we would be in a position to drown out a lot of the negatives and to focus on the lifting of the society and the building of the society. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of this. We need more civic organizations to organize and to drive the discussions, because when it's politicians who are doing it, you know what happens. It becomes politicized. So I want to thank the Bar Association for leading and to say you don't only need to do the Sir Archibald Nedd lecture, you can certainly organize a lot more of these so that we can have conversations about governance, lawmaking, you know, constitutionality, how we create a society and the role of law in creating the society. So I'm going to resubmit my team, which was rejected, for the next Sir Archibald Nedd lecture, which is The Role of Lawyers in Economic Development. Thank you.
Thank you. Provocative indeed. Mr. President, I hope you took note for the next lecture. We'll deliver, the Prime Minister will also deliver that lecture, in case he didn't know. Mr. Prime Minister, the Grenada Bar Association is honored that you agreed to deliver the feature address this evening and for participating in such an engaging question and answer segment. Food for thought, indeed. We ask that you do not leave immediately, as we have a token of appreciation for you. But before we do that, we invite Mr. Derek Sylvester to give a small token of appreciation to Mr. Ruggles Ferguson, KC, which will be collected on his behalf by Dr. Francis Alexis, KC.
There are some persons who would go the mile, and there are others who would go the extra mile. The latter relates to none other than our distinguished colleague, Mr. Ruggles Ferguson, King's Counsel. This award today is presented to Mr. Ferguson for his unwavering support, assistance, and dedication to the Grenada Bar Association and his commitment to this Sir Archibald Nedd Memorial Lecture Series. Mr. Ferguson has no boundary in relation to time when it comes to assisting the Grenada Bar Association. He has served as president for many years and was instrumental in coordinating this activity in the past. The Sir Archibald Nedd Lecture, as you heard, started in the year 1996 and continued in 1998 under the auspices of Mr. Ferguson, and he ensured it became a permanent feature on the annual calendar of the bar. He's always ready, willing, and able to assist the bar and can be reached at a moment's notice. He's never too busy to provide guidance and support, not only to the executive, but to anyone who needs his assistance. I am convinced that his day has 48 hours, and he sleeps in the 24 hours that he has created. The executive unanimously appreciates your contribution and presents to you this token inscribed with the words, Grenada Bar Association presented to Mr. Ruggles Ferguson, KC, in recognition of his sterling contribution to the Bar Association and legal profession. I also take this opportunity to wish Mr. Ferguson a happy birthday, since he's celebrating today. Mr. Jerry Edwin is also celebrating today. Mr. Ferguson is unavoidably out of state, as he left the jurisdiction this morning, but not before he was serenaded on the harmonica by Dr. Alexis and accompanied by yours truly. Of course, at the airport this morning, the security and other persons joined in singing happy birthday to Mr. Ferguson. I therefore ask Dr. Alexis KC to receive this award on Mr. Ferguson's behalf.
This morning at the crack of dawn, as King's Counsel Ruggles Ferguson was moving to enter the airport building, he was met by a delegation from the Grenada Bar Association. The president himself with his baritone voice, and I with my mouth organ. And as you heard, all within the sound of our voices and noises joined in, and there was a merry song throughout the airport saying, "Happy birthday, Ruggles Ferguson." When he got his breath, he warned me not to forget to remind the Grenada Bar Association that he deeply, profoundly appreciates this gesture. It means so much to him. And the only reason he's not in the jurisdiction tonight is that his wife commanded him to be with her tonight in St. Kitts. Happy am I, therefore, on behalf of King's Counsel Ruggles Ferguson, to convey to you, Mr. President, and your executive of the Grenada Bar Association, and it is not because of absence of appreciation, but it is only because of call to a higher duty he's not here tonight. But he sends his very deepest regards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alexis. And to show our appreciation to the Prime Minister, we ask Ms. Afi Ventuve de Vega, who is making her way up the stairs, to make our special presentation of thanks to you.
How many? Good evening, everyone. I feel lifted and full today, tonight, for what I would describe as a not just provocative discussion and conversation, but brave, bold, and brilliant. Conversations about reparations evoke feelings of hurt, pain, but we must also acknowledge healing and forgiveness. And I believe that your presentation today, Honorable Prime Minister, did justice to all those things and more. So from the executive and members of the Grenada Bar Association, we want to really thank you for taking the time to discuss such an important and serious topic with us tonight. I am happy that members of the public were able to share their thoughts and ask relevant questions. Unfortunately, those online may not have had such the privilege, but we thank you, we appreciate what you've done, and hopefully on the next lecture, your theme would make it to the top. Thank you very much again from the members of the bar.
To wrap things up this evening, we invite Mr. Kadeem Strawn, floor member of the Grenada Bar Association, to move the vote of thanks.
Permit me to adopt the protocol established this evening, and a good evening to everyone. A good evening to everyone. That's better. So I have the simple task tonight of thanking the individuals who would have made this event, this lecture tonight, the success that I think we can all agree that it was. Sure, you can applaud that. To begin, I would like to express my thanks to the Grenada Trade Center for agreeing for us to host the lecture here this year, as they have in the past. Certainly, we appreciate being housed in this venue for this purpose, to have this edifying discussion and to be able to provoke our thoughts so that we can have larger conversations which are relevant not just to our own personal development, but to the development of our nation on a whole. Permit me also to thank the persons who would have contributed to this evening's program, from our moderator, Ms. Shireen Wilkinson, who skillfully guided us throughout tonight's proceedings, to Pastor Jared Keynes Douglas, who invoked the presence of Almighty Father here this evening, Ms. Tamara St. Bernard, who graced us with a beautiful rendition of the national anthem, Mr. Derek Sylvester for delivering profound remarks on behalf of the bar, Mr. Francis Paul and Mr. Anderson Andel for presenting the biography and introduction of Sir Archibald Nedd and our featured speaker, respectively. Mrs. Afi Ventu de Vega for agreeing to present our featured speaker with a token of appreciation. I would also like to thank our specially invited guests here this evening. I see members of the government, I see judges of the High Court, I see the Chief Magistrate, and I see members of the business community, general public, students from the T. Marshall Community College. I think we can all agree that we've touched a large cross-section of our Grenadian society this evening. And certainly I think that has quite a bit to do with the featured speaker that we selected. I would also like to thank the persons who would have contributed in ways that are not quite evident here this evening. A lot goes into making a lecture like this possible. The executive team has certainly been working assiduously for months in terms of the planning and execution of this lecture here this evening, and not just the executive, but members of the general bar, and I do want us to give them a round of applause. Additionally, I would like to thank Mr. Damani Berzan for the decor that you see up on the stage here this evening. I would like to thank Tropical Catering Services Limited, who is providing refreshments after the ceremony this evening. The media personnel, T&R Communications, for streaming tonight's proceedings and for also making it available to persons who could not make it here physically. I would like to thank, of course, the general audience here present tonight. It's not easy to give up your Wednesday night to come down to the Trade Center to listen to somebody talk. But I think it says a lot about your commitment to education and to wanting to be edified that you presented yourself tonight. And so you too deserve a round of applause. I would also like to say thank you to the protocol team of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, led by Mr. Kerry Frank here this evening. Certainly, assistance was greatly appreciated, particularly considering the many special guests that we have here this evening. And last but by no means least, Honorable Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell, thank you for the riveting, thought-provoking, and quite radical presentation that you have made here this evening. I think certainly we all left with a more expanded concept of reparations, republicanism, and the rule of law. And we have also expanded our perspective in terms of what we hope to see for the next 50 years in Grenada's history as an independent state. We thank you for agreeing to deliver this evening's lecture, or as you prefer to call it, a conversation. And I know you think that your theme would have been better suited, but I think tonight is testament that this was a needed discussion for tonight. So perhaps in future, we can discuss that topic that you wanted to be discussed tonight, and you would accept another invitation to come and deliver on that lecture. So just to wrap up, I don't want to hold you too long. So again, thank you for sharing your time and your air with us this evening. And I do hope that you all have a safe journey home. Good night.
Thank you, distinguished guests, Honorable Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, all. It was my pleasure, my distinct pleasure, to act as your moderator this evening. And on behalf of the Grenada Bar Association, I wish you a good night, a safe journey home, and we look forward to seeing you and the Prime Minister with his topic in hand at the 20th Sir Archibald Nedd Memorial Lecture 2024. Wishing you a very safe journey home. Please permit the Prime Minister to leave first. Thank you. Oh, the Prime Minister has graciously indicated that he will stay with us for a few moments, so please permit him to at least leave the stage. Thank you. Good evening.